munificence, beneficence, autonomy, and justice.
Okay.
In these, the biggest debate which goes on between, depending on which way you are leaning towards, because inwards we have got an ethical person, and in the Western society, the major emphasis has been to practice autonomy or respect autonomy. So my body, my decision.
Yes.
I will have to always ask the people. And this sometimes in the Western philosophy is known as the holier than the holiest principle. And that is what we see the literature referring towards. Whereas now the medical bodies are shifting towards what now you can say Abrahamic religion principle. We did all that, we must not do any harm. That must be whatever treatment I'm prescribing, whatever treatment I'm withdrawing, if I'm going to do resuscitation, I'm going to put patients on ventilator, I'm going for organ donation request or not, it must be based on non-maleficence principle. I'm not harming the patient. This is the key base.
How fascinating. You've very interestingly brought in faith issues. You've brought in some of the key principles. You've mentioned virtue ethics in the context of medical ethics, and the other two methodologies, deontological and consequentialism. So it's a fascinating area. For a layperson, of course, this could all be very, very new. Most people have never read Kant. They will never have studied deontological kind of ethics. They won't have studied consequentialism. They won't know. So it's fascinating to see this world exist. Virtue ethics, as you rightly said, I mean, we've dealt on this program before with the idea of character and virtue as being a core part of the prophetic mission. So in terms of the way you're dealing with human beings at the beginning of life, during life, or the end of life is a central question for Islam at all times. I mean, Islam in terms of Sharia, in terms of the inner practice, in terms of the akhlaqiyat, is nothing but dealing with this constant question of what is right, what is wrong. You're doing it quite clearly on a professional level. And I'd like to bring Dr. Hashim Raza in on the conversation. Welcome to the show, Dr. Hashim.
Assalamu alaikum.
Alaikum assalam.
For inviting me.
Very, very nice of you to give us your time. I know you gentlemen are pressed for time always, and it's our good fortune that we've got two heavyweights in the conversation today. Thank you for joining us. But I'm kind of thinking aloud, really, and for the ordinary person, let's take your field, psychiatry. Mental health is certainly something which is massively on the rise as a problem, as an issue within our Western society, probably broader as well across the world. But I'm going to keep it specific to Britain, so it helps us to focus a little in your area of practice. But how does medical ethics impact your work as a psychiatrist, as somebody who deals on the ground with people, especially around issues of suicide, depression, mental health, and such things?
Ethics is a fundamental part of the practice. I think it will be helpful if I explain first that as a psychiatrist, I'm primarily trained as a doctor, because all psychiatrists, they first qualify as a doctor before they go on to specialize in mental illnesses and mental disorders.
I see.
So I just caught the tail end of the conversation of the previous speaker, and the principle of do no harm is the first, Hippocratic principle that is the fundamental basis of medical ethics, primum non nocere. So that in many ways does drive whatever I do. So my work is primarily listening to very complex issues, mostly to the narrative of the person, their lived experience, matching it with my knowledge and with the kind of knowledge structures we have got, in which we conceptualize different mental illnesses or mental disorders, and then trying to match it with the person. And it immediately brings in the personal values of the people into the conversation, into the discussion. There would be agreements, partial or total, or disagreements, partial or total. And accordingly, the ethics will come into that in my professional practice, I should be non-judgmental, I should not be imposing my own values on the person. And in a problem-solving attitude, creating a space in which the person who suffers with the problem knows the the best, what is good for them, and in a non-patronizing manner, explaining the options available to them, explaining the evidence base, the knowledge base we have as to which intervention works and does not work. And then, accordingly, the conversation goes on and the discussion goes on.
Okay. Just to contextualize a little more and to bring in the faith question, I want to work out whether you have any, if you like, collisions between your professional practice and what you're taught and trained from a Western perspective and the things that you know of from, say, for instance, an Islamic ethical perspective. Is there any difference? Do you find a crisis of conscience on some issues? I mean, let me take abortion, for instance, and as an example for doctors. And maybe I should point this to Dr. Qamar Abbas first, and then come back, because euthanasia and abortion are two issues which I think from an Islamic or a faith perspective might be a minefield. But how do we negotiate such things as a professional? Dr. Qamar.
Although I will be having some understanding of abortion, but like I said, my clinical work as well as my academic work is based towards end-of-life care ethics.
Sure.
So I don't want to pretend that I'm an expert on beginning of the life.
Sure.
So, but the principle might remain the same. When you're talking about euthanasia and to the life actively, obviously the interesting part for me is that in United Kingdom, for example, there from the beginning of my career, there have been two different groups. One is called Dignity in Dying, which basically is pro-euthanasia.
Right.
Euthanasia basically means actively finishing a patient's life and terminating them by doing something actively, meaning injecting them or giving them some medicines which will end the life actively. So this is the Dignity in Dying which supported it. The other part of that is, which is going back to your question, to put some context to it, is Care Not Killing. Care Not Killing is an alliance of many organizations in this country, including my field, which is represented nationally by Association of Palliative Medicine. Association of Palliative Medicine is a national body to which all the doctors and consultants, as well as trainees, they are usually members of all over the United Kingdom. It has had from the beginning this stand that euthanasia should not be legalized. Now, how does it work? Going to the Islamic faith, it's not just about Islamic faith, it was also an Abrahamic religion's view as well. But this was something which people were able to bring into the debate to the table very clearly, that what are our reasons for doing it. And that was fascinating for me to see from the last 15 years that how the debate has developed. So much so that actually now what we are talking about there are two debates. One is euthanasia ethical? Second is making euthanasia legal ethical? And there, people were able to convince, basically, from the faith perspective, if you look at Church of England, if you look at the synagogues, World Jewish Congress, all of them have actively produced documents against it. Because the life had been sexuous. We all, for example, people can out there say it's an outdated idea, but they have actually had the strong view that life is actually given by God to be taken away by God. And there comes the suffering argument. And why does suffering exist here then? If the God is a loving God, why people suffer? And then you go into the details of that. And then there is another ethical debate which goes something like, is suffering really a harmful thing? Is it actually the human soul? And not over this debate, just come on the front about that. So religions were very good in putting these things on the table, that actually we do not believe euthanasia is ethical, and not just arguing just because the God said so. So actually putting the issues which are on the table, which are talking about the slippery slope argument. If you legalized assisted dying today, in which only the people who are towards the end of life and we are doing it, you have to go back to only the Second War. What happened in Nazi Germany? The first idea, the slippery slope argument came at that time, that actually, firstly, the termination of the life was practiced only for the people who were burdened on the society, who were terminally ill. Later on the same, but the society got immune to the idea of actively killing people. And is why Hitler could go on to do what he did.
Well, interesting that Richard Dawkins, Dr. Hashim returns. Richard Dawkins said basically we need religions to this, but here's a classic example of how religions still have a very huge impact in affecting ethical decision making within human society. And we live in a Western society. Increasingly, people poo-poo religion from the non-Muslim sector anyway, and Christianity certainly dwindling in terms of numbers. So the Dawkins, if you like, arguments do need strong and robust counter-arguments. Do you think this is a role yourself and people like Dr. Qamar Abbas, who not only are practicing Muslims, but also have a professional understanding of secular philosophy and ideology and thinking, which leads to the medical ethics field making decisions? I mean, of course, this is going to be a huge issue because things like, for instance, DNA and genetic engineering and robotic engineering and information technology, all of this is going to explode over the next 50 years. And there are going to be huge ethical decisions that humanity is going to have to make. Do you think that Islam and professionals like yourself, along with maybe even the ulama, have a real responsibility looming to get ready for all sorts of discussions and battles and if you like, intellectual stand-up points against moral relativists like perhaps Richard Dawkins?
Who is getting in kind of his splitting very necessary arguments of determining the definitions of different concepts, which ultimately go on to have an impact on what will be the legalistic interpretation of each one of the words we use in language. So there are layers and layers of complexity in it. When people go for trying to define a fiqhi position on everything, people tend to get such emotional attachment and hang-up as if everything which a jurist say has got a direct divine sanctity attached to it. And I think most of our citizens living wherever they're living in predominantly Muslim societies or predominantly secular societies, they need to grow up a bit, they need to get real a bit, and they need to try to understand that at the end of the day, a fiqhi position is a view of a jurist. Jurist will create a dividing line between right and wrong, even if it is kind of arbitrary, and even if another generation of jurists would disagree with that. That's the reality of Shia fiqh, where we insist on a living jurist trying to interpret the question of the challenge of the time. And I would dare to submit that in that respect, our Maraje are no different than the law lords in the country that we have adopted as a home here in Great Britain. So the law lords in UK, in the context of the Parliament, for me as an informed citizen, I'm not a jurist, I'm not an ethicist, but as a qualified professional carrying reasonable responsibilities in a complex social systems that I'm part of, the law lords in this country are like the Maraji of this country. And when an issue cannot be resolved in a discussion between me and my patient, we will go through layers of escalations until we go to the law lords and then we put the final word on it. Same goes with our jurists. Unfortunately, the reality, as again a practicing Muslim and reasonably educated person, the reality is that we are very fond of banging our drums that Islam knows everything and tells us everything. The reality is far from that. We do not have sufficiently qualified people even articulating the question properly. Unless we accept that reality, we just keep on a shared delusion of religiosity, which does not really do us much good.
That's
I hope it's being too controversial in saying all that.
Well, that's certainly putting the cat amongst the pigeons. Dr. Qamar, I'll let you come back on that.
That's a very, very important point. I think this is a very important point which Dr. Raza made, that actually many times we actually look towards ulama who have got a fiqhi or the jurist style of resolving these issues. I do not look at it as a jurist style or the fiqhi style. I think what we forget that actually Islam is, when we talk about it, how much of the Islamic literature is about fiqh. We forget about the plethora of the mantiq, of logic, of philosophy, of the ikhlaq, ethics, which
the
goes
history,
into
philosophy,
history, and everything which goes with it. And I think there is a role, and again, like you used the word, putting the cat among the pigeons, let me do my bit here. Because what I would say that actually now, being a doctor, like Dr. Raza is a specialist psychiatrist, and he will also know that within psychiatry there are subspecialties. We are actually getting so much knowledge disseminated. In our palliative medicine field, there are different fields where people are getting specialists in their own ways. Cardiology, neurology, whatever you take. In Islam as well, we have been following a model which might have been extremely useful, and I have absolutely no doubt, some time back, where one person who was actually researching on fiqh aspects of it could come up with a lot of answers.
Sure.
Today, we have got so many different issues that it might be useful to actually look at if there is somebody who actually has got a scholastic value in terms of ethics, in terms of just the development of ahadith, in terms of philosophy, in terms of logic, in terms of history. And this is where we actually, when virtue ethics works, because when I have spoken to people about these things, and that includes the religious people as well as non-religious people, when I'm teaching, I sometimes actually, I start by my lecture quite often asking the question, when I'm doing the ethics lecture, I say, okay, let's see today who got out of their bed trying to do really harm. And everybody just laughs at it and says, because none of us does.
Yeah, nobody gets that.
We have so this notion of virtue ethics, which was embedded in Abrahamic religion, which we do not actually look at and read about the ins and outs of it as much. That might actually resolve more things than actually looking at a very fiqhi and a specialist fiqh point of view. Many times, what are the answers? Yes, there are complexity, how you communicate that to the patient. In my field, every day, classically conversation I will be having or supporting my colleagues to have, there is a treatment in which we call cardiopulmonary resuscitation, in which we shock the patients, jump on their chest and try to revive the heart. Majority of my patients have got very end stage disease like cancer or organ failures. This treatment is not going to work there. Now, the media, especially the television and the movies and sensational programs like Holby City and ER, the way they have actually put that on the screen, that actually everybody who's actually, you jump on their chest and 5 minutes later they are having a cup of tea.
Yeah.
It doesn't work like that.
No.
It's a treatment which is a clinical decision which I have to offer. However, I have got very difficult decision every day with the patients who say, well, actually this treatment will not work. They see that you are putting the patient on a death sentence now.
Right.
Now, here comes your communication skills. So when we are talking about bringing Islam into it, it's not about the fit part of it. It's actually, has it got any ethical principle which it can offer me to put on the table for the patients? And here comes a virtue ethics model, where you actually say, my usual question to that patient family is, you look after your dad, you have seen how he is deteriorating, how do you see he will be in the next 3 months?
I see.
And inherently, that person practices virtue ethics. They say, well, actually, inherently, I know he won't be here. Then what should be our priority? Should we keep him comfortable? You use your communication to go to that point. But I will use that principle which my virtue ethics has given me. But how do I communicate? That's most important.
Fascinating. Dr. Hashim Raza, this is interesting. I mean, there's so many directions I can take this conversation now in terms of the scholars, the jurisprudential and religious scholars and their relationships with professionals like yourselves, whether there need to be institutions which almost create that integration, whether they exist, whether they've started being developed, and how do jurisprudence really, in a way, keep up with the scale of knowledge that is out there and the scale of issues that need to be dealt with and the depth of the problems that need to be solved. That's one issue in itself, because you can't expect one Maharaja to be able to cope with knowing sociology, anthropology, psychiatry, let alone within one field of science.
Moonsighting.
Yeah, moonsighting. I mean, it's a nonsense. So there quite clearly is a huge finger pointing at our spiritual of the calling into question. But I'm going to shift the conversation back to actually a more practical side of things. That, of course, individuals are who you deal with. On the ground, it's people who are affected by these decisions. And are there any occasions where you're torn between, or which actually cause specific problems to Muslims within your profession, which are different from, say, the general masses? Are there cases where you've had to make sort of ethical or moral decisions which involved, faith in one way or another?
Indeed, of course, I think the answer is yes. The most occurring common problem tends to be where people consider mental illnesses, mental disorders, as something akin to spiritual weakness, which very quickly gets confused with possible weakness in one's faith or religious principles. And that's where, probably commonly, the dilemma arises for me. I must add that in my current practice, I've been working in Britain for nearly 20 years now. It is not very common for me to come across patients. I work in NHS full time, and the patch I have been working in, Muslims are really in a minority. But before coming to England, I have been practicing in Karachi for well over 7 years. So some of the observations I have here through very limited contact with Muslim patients in Britain does have many similarities that I saw when I was practicing full time in Pakistan. That people do tend to have a considerable lack of understanding of the nature of mental disorders, interventions that are available, how they can be effective, and how in some ways it is really independent, mostly independent, I would say, of anyone's faith and other traditions. And the example, for example, I can quote is that as public knowledge has increased on how, for example, heart diseases are caused and how it is attributable to lifestyle, the diet we eat, some hereditary factors in terms of family risk. And over many decades, people have grown more and more knowledgeable. They have embraced and adopted the Western knowledge and incorporated that into their lifestyles. I do not see a similar pattern in terms of mental disorders. There still is a huge disconnect in terms of people's understanding of effective treatments. And I must say many of our treatments are not really effective. And many of the treatments which many psychiatrists prescribe, they also tend to be poorly focused, helter-skelter in some ways. So therefore we have a huge challenge of public perception as to what is the place of psychiatry and psychiatric practice. And that, in a way, keeps on creating conflict. So in my encounter with the patient, the challenge and dilemma for me will be that do I compromise my ethical principles and in a rather judgmental, patronizing manner insist on the patient to do what I'm recommending them to do? Or do I step back a bit, let them take their time to come to the conclusion after having tried every other remedy, what works and what does not work, and they may come back and engage with me in therapy at a considerably later time, perhaps with many complications having set in, and possibly perhaps illness having become somewhat resistant to treatment also. So these are probably the most frequent dilemma I face.
I see. Well, mental health, of course, is, for those who were immigrants who came from very rural backgrounds, there was a very common notion that mental health is madness. It's almost, there's just one generic term, that somebody had a few screws loose. And that in itself is a problem, surely.
Muslim, can I interrupt and challenge this Orwellian doublespeak? When we say mental health, do we mean mental illness?
Yeah, indeed. I mean, there in itself, mental illness, mental health, and I guess there's a minefield.
Please. I'm really a bit, finicky about this.
My meaning...
In a world where we use words without bothering as to what they mean.
Yes.
And that ends up complicating the message even further.
Sure. So mental health, I mean, what would be...
Saying that I'm talking about mental illnesses and mental disorders, and not really about mental health.
Sure. So mental illness is effectively, for the ordinary person, is when somebody has things like, I guess, schizophrenia or conditions which are related to a breakdown in...
Somebody real disorders. Let me again, share this observation with you, that the severe mental illnesses, which in common man's language will be akin to madness or pagalpan in Urdu.
Right.
I can, in a way, relate to that. If a family member describes something to me in those languages, it is still my job to interpret as to what they're trying to convey, what is the lived experience, and what is the kind of the personal narrative. So those illnesses are actually quite rare.
Right.
And they tend to occur less than 1%.
Right.
So, you need to know 100 people very well before you will know the first one with one of those illnesses. Compared with that, what we call less severe illnesses, in no way I imply that they are less disabling. The illnesses which we, in our technical jargon, consider less severe, they still are very disabling, and they are still, compromise people's functionality in many, many ways at many levels. So I hope, this does not get confused as if we poo-poo those illnesses and do not deal with them.
No, thank you for clarifying.
What we refer to in technical terms is neuroses.
Right.
And those neuroses are 4 to 6 to 10 times more common.
Right.
And most people's experience of coming across somebody suffering with a mental disorder will be either a mood disorder or a severe anxiety disorder or a variation on that. And then there is a group of people, we call them kind of personality disorders. It's a group loosely defined, but it is people who maladaptive patterns of dealing with social negotiations, complex, stressful situations. And whereas most people who are mentally healthy or reasonably resourced in problem-solving skills, they will make some of those mistakes and they will keep on learning from the outcomes and keep on changing their patterns. And they do not get stuck in those maladaptive patterns, whereas people with personality disorders would remain stuck, using the same behavior patterns which actually do not serve a purpose. And that creates a lot of grief in them and in people around them.
Well, clearly this is a huge area, and it's something that I think I'd like to revisit, because I'm literally just touching on these issues to almost create like a few sentences of summary. You can't do justice to it, obviously, but this whole minefield of not even understanding the various technical differences is, I know, within our community is a big issue. And, I've had some statistics which say that Muslim women, for instance, are 3 times more likely to be suffering from mental illness, actually. And, suicide, I think you previously had mentioned that Muslims are much more likely to commit suicide than their Western counterparts or the Anglo-Saxon counterparts. All of these things are hugely concerning and means that we've got to focus on them. But, I mean, bringing it back to the issue of ethics.
Let me interrupt again. I'm really sorry, but I need to correct. Please. I'm not aware of any research or data confirming what you just said, that Muslim people are more likely to commit suicide.
Right.
I suspect that the numbers and statistics you could be possibly confusing is that there was a piece of research many years ago in Leicester where when attempted suicide, self-harm, was investigated among women, young women for that, people from Asian background had 3 times more incident of self-harm compared with their white British counterparts.
So that wasn't quite suicide, it was self-harm.
That data set did not tease out the religion.
Right.
But we have got many other indices which do show that unfortunately people from Pakistan and Bangladesh, who tend to be mostly Muslims, they actually worse quite poorly on lots and lots of social indices. That's education, that's employment, and that's also in mental illnesses, that the numbers tend to be disproportionately high compared with other ethnic backgrounds and other immigrant backgrounds who seem to have fared reasonably better in coping with the stresses which immigration brings in its whole with it.
Well, that and of course there are going to be things like diet and our own lifestyles. I'm going to turn to Dr. Qamar Abbas. Thank you so much for clarifying many issues, critical issues, or issue of mental health. Nafsi is an old Arabic word which puts the deal of with psychology, traditional Islamic. Don't have a deep knowledge, but I'm sure we got a whole discussion there, Dr. Hashim, at some stage about where those marry. Spiritual leaders, peers these days, and even religious scholars can end up acting as counselors or people who are advising, people who often the community turns to them. So that's another area to investigate as to how we can maybe make those systems more robust and train perhaps the individuals who are giving the advice. But Dr. Qamar, you can see as soon as we open up a particular issue, there are huge problems that are related to the community around all these different issues. But let's take, for instance, organ donation as another battleground, potentially, between those who have religious perspectives and the professionals. Organ donation, there's no Quranic verse which actually organ donation in the context of our ethical stance or the virtue ethics stance. There aren't, to my knowledge, any hadith which also dealt with it. And evidently, scholars, when they arrived at the issue, dealt with it simply through their analysis of the phrase of the ayah which talked about the life of one person, saving the life of one person, being equivalent to saving the life of entire humanity. That's a Quranic verse which they based then their justification for saying, it's ethically fine to go ahead with organ donation. Do you deal with these kind of decisions, and how comfortable do you feel with the religious aspect of it and the rulings?
Well, I think firstly, before I go and delve into fiqh of this, which firstly I'm not a fiqh scholar. I will refer to a little bit, but let's go just when you look at the virtue ethics and marry that up with the organ donation issue. When we already know that actually some particular organ will help save somebody's life, what is there to say that it should not happen? I've got a very black and white attitude about these things.
Sure.
I understand that certain scholars will also talk about the sanctity of the human body, and that it should not be put to any distress, even after the people have died, to take any organ out. But as I understand, when I was many years back now, when I was trying to present a paper on these things, all across the board, Ahl Sunnah, from Jamiatul Azhar, in fact, the Islamic Society of Singapore, the Mufti there, the Mufti in Muslim Council of Britain, as well as Ayatollah Sistani, and first person was actually Ayatollah Fazlullah, who came up, which was, well, actually, that is the right thing to do. After that, Ayatollah Nasir Makaram Shirazi, and then Ayatollah Sistani. Only one caveat there is that, which, again, I'm not a scholar, so please don't challenge me on that.
Sure.
I'm just quoting what I got the response from, and that is available for everybody to read. Is Ayatollah Sistani said that it should be donated to a Muslim, whereas Ayatollah Fazlullah and Ayatollah Nasir Makaram Shirazi, at that time, who were the pioneers, now there are others as well, they had absolutely no contradiction to say, preference to where it is going. Receiving an organ definitely has always been allowed. You will remember that blood donation, within those Islamic scholars, Ayatollah Khoi was the first one, sorry, not blood, corneal donation. Ayatollah Khoi was the first one to basically come up with a decree about that. So when we talk about the organ donation, to my mind, maybe I'm very simplistic about these things, but the way I have read it, it is a benevolent thing, which people should be, and I do deal with these things. I do ask the patients. In my patients, the problem is that because they have got widespread cancer, most of the organs can't be used. So really the organ which can be used is cornea. And I do ask that question, that have you thought about it? Afterwards, in UK, that any organ, including the cornea, cannot be taken out if the family objects.
I see.
If there's nothing to do with Islam, that's the way the law is here. So even if the patient gives a consent before they die and they have got a donor card, But the family objects after they have died, then we cannot take that organ out. So these are the things that, however, in my job, that objection is very seldom to come. It has happened, but very rarely.
Autopsies are another battleground, aren't they? I mean, Muslims invariably are uncomfortable with the idea of autopsies, or many Muslims certainly are. Does that go according to the law here? Ultimately, whatever the law says and whatever the establishment says goes?
Ultimately, the law of the land has to prevail. That's the line. So again, no disrespect to the one way or the other. But the practical thing is, a doctor who is certifying the death and issuing a death certificate has to be reasonably confident that this is the cause of death. There does not have to be legally that you have to be 100% confident. The word is the reasonably confident. So when you issue an MCCD or medical certificate for cause of death, then that is the only question asked. Are you reasonably confident? And what is the basis of your decision? So when a doctor issues a certificate that could be registered as a death with a cause of death with a registrar, and usually in, like, for example, if you are going for a burial, that's the end of it. If you are going for a cremation, because obviously if you cremate a body, there's no coming back to it. So you can't do an autopsy later on. So there has to be an independent doctor who has to interview the first doctor to ask, why did you issue the certificate for this cause of death? Then it goes to a medical referee who has to agree with all this. And then only the body is allowed to be cremated. Coming back to the Muslim issues, if we do not have a reasonably confident cause of death, by law, the doctor will have to report that to a coroner. In my experience, as you will understand the nature of my job, I do it with coroners a lot. Coroners are usually quite lenient, who will usually quite helpful in that sense, that they will actually try to help the doctors to come to a reasonable cause of death. So they might actually do the inquest by themselves. They will ask for all the patient's notes, they will go through that, and then they will issue a death certificate, or advise the doctor to do that. However, if none of us can come to a cause of death reasonably, then it has to go to an autopsy, and that's the law of the land.
Dr. Hashim, your views on this issue of organ donation, is there there are side issues, of course. Once you open up this notion of being able to help individuals, of course, it's a life-saving issue. But there have been increasing allegations recently of refugees from Syria and organ harvesting, and it opens up this other area of the future, where, for instance, organs are being grown within laboratories and such like things. Do you have a view on the Islam and the ethics around such things, around the future development of, if you like, issues that we're going to have to perhaps think about as Muslims and decide whether they are actually in keeping with our conscience? I mean, I can think of several areas in the future in terms of developing various organs and putting them. Have there been discussions in your circles around these sort of things?
Not really.
So this is.
I think Dr. Abbas is better placed to comment on that.
This is more his field, I think.
Outside my area of expertise.
Sure. But in terms of the nafsiyat question, I kind of rather belatedly thought about that. The existing works and books and this field of nafsiyat from the Aima Masumin, there are links to a lot of spiritual psychology, if you like. And there's also, of course, Jungian psychological treaties, and there's the Freudian. Do you think in the modern day, in terms of the ethics around psychological development of individuals, or even analyzing has a...
Of course it has. As long as if I echo some of the comments Dr. Abbas has already made, that if you do not consider Islam as limited and synonymous to faith, and we look at it in the broad sense, then in terms of the values and in terms of the principles of conduct, personal as well as public, of course, there is a lot which needs to be said and which need to be shared. But the challenge then is that the overarching paradigms are really hugely different. The knowledge which has been curated by the Western capitalistic society for last 300-400 years, the fundamental value at the root of all of that is the individual. And the new liberal capitalistic turn of the recent decades has in a way showed the limits and the ugliness and the harm which comes out of that approach. And compared with that, whatever limited understanding of faith we have got, in that, Islam is very similar to my limited understanding of other great faiths, that all these faith traditions create some kind of a balance between the individual and the group, the community, and the society at large. And, where does the boundary exist? Where does the group or the community become too oppressive for the individual and starts stifling the individual, giving rise to psychological and emotional problems? And what is the limit to beyond which an individual should not be expecting the liberties and independence and celebration of the personal quirkinesses? These are the debates which I believe have to continue generation on generation. No one generation can claim that they have discovered the ultimate truth, and that's where I see the problem lying. That a lot of conversation, discussion, and discourse under the name of Islam tends to be absolutely backward, as if the truth has been written in a divine book somewhere or in a quote from the Holy Imam, and then we lost it, and then we need to rediscover it. I believe that is far too simplistic. It does not actually provide us with answers. It probably carries the risk of nurturing even more frustration and disillusionment and alienation. And the real proper conversation can begin only when people own up what they do not know, and then they start on a search of trying to discover the knowledge, interpreting the knowledge, and agreeing some rules around that.
I think that's a very important point there, Dr. Hashim, in terms of the focus being on principles and critical reasoning, critical inquiry, the thirst for knowledge, rather than trying to justify some glorious past that may or may not have been there. That seems to be where a lot of the Muslim discourse is still out. But I want to come back with the question that I was putting to Dr. Hashim, which is look into the future, looking into our crystal ball. And, particularly this area of, interstellar travel, perhaps, or, the idea of cloning, animals, the various quantum, physics knowledge bases which are opening up, but particularly biogenetics. Focusing on that in particular, stem cell research has proven that actually we're going to be going into a brave new world, and the kind of powers that humanity has to change the very nature of humanity might well be in question. Are these issues that concern you as a medical, ethics? I know you deal with euthanasia, that's your primary field, but is it an area where Muslims are involved in looking into the future and saying, well, what are our thoughts around these, and what sort of world do we want to shape? Or is that an exclusively white male institutional preserve, do you think?
Necessarily, that actually white dominated area. I think this is it in the first place. If they are doing it to find some benefit to the society, benefit for the humanity, then my simplistic view will be what is there wrong about it? Obviously, for example, a few years back, obviously in my field, obviously I'm not doing it, but people who are terminally ill, and they come to me. Like, for example, I had a patient with Parkinson's, and we were talking about at that time in the stem cell treatment for Parkinson's, and there were questions about it. So why should we be taking this as a different treatment to any treatment we already have? We already receive immunotherapies. We already use chemotoxic drugs, which are basically for cancer agents, which are taken from, like antibiotics. We take it from a living being, and we inject in you to cause vaccination in you.
Right.
We have been doing it for years. What is the principle behind it? The principle is simply whichever resource we are taking it from, if it is not harming the initial source and helping the recipient, then we should be following it. Again, my understanding, coming back again, I'm not a fiqh scholar. I keep on saying this disclaimer,
sure.
But my understanding from them is that as long as that harvesting, even the cloning of it, is for human benefit and it's not going to harm the basically donor, then it has been debated and it has been partially allowed. And my view is that my honest, strong feeling, use the word crystal ball, is that it will become. Because look at it this way, the common sense will prevail. That if the common sense is telling us that something is beneficial for us, human nature will be going towards it. We only need to go, well, a few hundred years back, obviously, but do we want to go back to that huge war and battles of Renaissance time, when the Catholicism and Protestants were actually fighting with each other and fought for decades and decades and butchered each other? Why? Because of the outdated, primitive ideas and trying to bring some change to it. So I'm not taking any side here, but that was, if you look at Martin Luther King Sr. at that time, who stood up for it, he was a priest. But he could see that actually you need to change, you need to adopt. And that is where actually, I made a speech some time back as well, that actually this is where, if you look at the foundation of the Shia Islam, it has been quite based on that from the very beginning, you have got to do ijtihad.
Ijtihad, yes.
You have got to change. You have got to bring the intellect into it. And if you didn't, then what's the point of the simple principle of adl? Tawheed, after Tawheed, we actually placed adl. We did not put anything else.
Yes.
The reason we want justice, we actually appreciate justice, is actually it's for the God to judge all of us, but we need to practice our aql, or our intellect, to the best of our capabilities. If we wouldn't do that, then in fact we are harming the basic principles of Islam.
Well made point. Dr. Hashim, last word from you, and then I'll get a conclusion from Dr. Qamar Abbas as well. We've just got a couple of minutes left. If you had to give some advice to our theological institutions, and given all these, if you like, ethical issues, let's stick to medical ethics, just in this field alone, what would you say to our ulama and their relationship with academics out in the field?
There is a huge need for a dialogue. We to different tribes, we speak different language, and we need to show respect to each other. We need to try to create a dialogue in which we try to come close in terms of understanding each other's principles, each other's grounding values, and the language that we use, and the terms and the jargon we tend to throw at each other. Without that, knowledge cannot grow. Without that, we cannot determine what in the existing knowledge is perfectly compatible with Islamic principles and what is fundamentally repugnant with these Islamic principles.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Hashim, for a very valuable contribution and for joining us. We'd love to have you in the studio sometime in the near future when you are on some holidays. Hopefully we could spoil your holiday by getting you to do some more work with us. But thank you so much for joining us. Jazakallah khair. And Dr. Qamar, the final word goes to yourself. You talked about virtue ethics. You opened the batting with the idea of virtue ethics being the common ground for perhaps where faith and non-faith individuals and humanity as a whole could coalesce to fashion ethics, medical ethics particularly. What's your final advice to people from all parts of the spectrum that are dealing with medical ethics? What would you like to see?
The important thing here is that Dr. Raza made a very important point, that the dialogue needs to go on. The dialogue among our respected clerics, but the professional side, so actually has got some insight, the researchers should go on, as well as academics. There are many prongs of the society which will contribute to this debate. So when you come down back to the virtue ethics side of it, that dialogue will be the essence of it.
Right.
And where else to better learn from? Like I'm very fond of the Islamic history and to teach that as well. Islamic history actually tells us about so much. If you can stand up in the Battle of Karbala and you can have a dialogue at that time, you can have dialogue anywhere. When you can stand up in the court of Yazid and have a dialogue, you can have it anywhere.
It was a dialogue of virtue ethics.
Dialogue of virtue ethics. Just putting the common sense on the front table. When Yazid says, I'll actually don't talk about me, I'll talk about me, Imam says. And he just tells who he is. So what is my good things, what are my opinions about things in any debate like medical ethics, I can bring on the table, and I'm prepared to change. And I have learned so much working in palliative medicine as well as talking to the people from Care Not Killing. I learned a lot from them. I learned a lot from my patients, believe you me. They are the best teachers I have learned from. And this is the knowledge we can share with each other.
Well, Dr. Qamar, thank you for taking the trouble to come into the studio on what is a really, really important area of discussion. And discussion, dialogue, systems, mechanisms for connecting both between the ulama and the jurisprudence and our academic intellectuals, if you like, or practitioners within all sorts of fields. Quite clearly, we've discussed the area of medicine or medical ethics, but that can go across to the social sciences. It could step across to our view of history or politics. In a sense, never has it been even so important that we actually get ourselves organized, perhaps create institutions, create methodologies, systems, processes, and spaces where this dialogue can take place. Perhaps it's not happening fast enough, but in a world where social media, the internet, and all sorts of other communications methods are there, I think it's an area which it's high time we invested in, perhaps very, very seriously. Purpose of having an influential view on how humanity shapes its future. If Islam and Muslims don't want to be involved in that dialogue, it's a massive mistake, because what may go in a direction which is very contrary to prophetic virtue ethics. Yeah.